This is Tell Me Exactly, an emergency communications podcast. I'm your host, Meridith Jensen. Today we're talking about the concept of first-party gone on arrivals, and this comes from the Principles of EMD textbook. And joining me today is one of my favorite experts from our implementations department, Brian Dale. Hi, Brian. Thanks for coming.
Hi, Meredith. Thanks for having me on.
Tell us a little bit about your role.
Well, I'm a subject matter expert for medical, fire, and EMDQ, or EDQ in general. So I spend a lot of my time working with agencies on implementing and managing the fire medical protocols and doing case review and feedback.
Yeah, and you are just obviously one of the leading experts in all things related to this topic. So I'm really glad that you're joining me to talk about this today. And so we wanted to talk a little bit today about how to create a policy for first party gone on arrivals. So Brian, let's just talk about that a little bit. Let's start with how do we define a gone on arrival call?
Well, I think the first ones we became aware of where a person was having a medical problem inside of their home or apartment, and EMS and or fire would arrive. The person wasn't answer the door. They couldn't see anybody through the windows. They didn't have easy access, and so they figured that the person had left, had gone private vehicle to the hospital or taken some other way, and was no longer in the residence. And multiple times the patient was found inside, and they had unfortunately expired.
Yeah.
We've also had a case where an agency was responding on a woman on a snowy evening, came in as a person down, and they didn't find her as they drove around. They never got up. They never got out of the apparatus and looked around, and she unfortunately had collapsed in the snow, and she too did not survive. And it could be any discipline, right? You could have an automatic alarm, fire alarm going off on a home. And, they drive by and they don't see anything. It's been a long day. They don't do a 360 of the residence and the fires in the basement or something, and they don't do their due diligence and they come back on a structure fire later on. Or you could have a police incident, the same thing, right? Someone feel like they're in trouble or they're in danger, and the police arrives, no one answers the door, they don't make access, they don't see any break-in, they figure the person left and the person had been being held hostage or had been injured or killed in some way inside the home. And so the thing becomes then, I guess, if we ask ourselves the question, how do we make sure we do our due diligence? What does that mean for fire, for EMS, and for police? And does the agency have an obligation to create some type of, not gone on arrival, but some type of policy regarding what is the expected practice when we arrive on a scene, no matter the discipline, and we do not have someone to speak to us? How far should we go?
Right, because what we're trying to avoid, obviously, are those worst case scenarios that you described. I mean, that's obviously the kind of worst of the worst of it. And so, yeah, I mean, I know from my experience too, we also had the other end of the spectrum, truly gone on arrival situations where, someone would call in and request an ambulance for someone outside of the 7-Eleven, and as soon as that person who had previously been thought unconscious laying on the ground outside of the 7-Eleven heard those fire trucks coming, they got up and, started walking away. So we can certainly have truly gone on arrival situations, but how do you make sure that that's not one of those worst case scenarios that you're describing?
I mean, there is an incident where a person was having a medical emergency and they were outside of a apartment building. And when the EMS crews arrived, they were not in their apartment, nor were they outside, which is where they were when the call came in. And so you started looking for them. They looked all over the grounds, in the parking lot, in an alley, one block over, still nothing. And they felt they had done their due diligence and they left. And the person happened to be another half a block in an alleyway, and the person did not survive. But they were not held liable because, do you start going block by block by block until you find somebody? What is reasonable? How far do you have to go to meet that reasonable standard? In that case, the court felt that they had met the standard.
Okay. So yeah, that definitely plays a big role in it, right? The litigation piece and the liability of it. And then of course, like you mentioned as well, the reasonableness, which is a huge factor because you're right. We can't expect our resources to, when they don't get contact, start a massive manhunt looking for
Yeah,
that
start a
person.
grid
But
search.
yeah, exactly.
There's another scenario too. So I became aware of an incident where a gentleman home alone was having chest pain. He
Mm-hmm.
called 911 and it went to a county combined communication center. And he had said he was having chest pain, 60-ish years old, and said he had a little bit of difficulty breathing and no history. His wife had gone shopping. He was trying to wait for her to come back, but seemed to be getting worse. The comm center that took the call did not respond. They gave it to another entity that it was in their city, their jurisdiction. And so they sent the call. And in the meantime, the caller had called back and said that his wife was on the way home and she could let them in. And then another few minutes had passed, and as the paramedic ambulance, I guess, had arrived on scene, was sitting in front of the home, he had called back and said that he thought he was getting better and he didn't want to go to the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And so the ambulance that was parked in front of his home pulled away. His wife came home an hour later, finding him dead in the living room.
Mm.
And so even if he wanted to cancel, you know,
We should have put eyes on him.
a
Yeah.
good practice would have been to knock on the door, shake his hand,
Mm-hmm.
say, "Hey, I heard you're having some pain today. Let's take a look at you," and at least assess him and have him sign an AMA or a
Right.
private transport, whatever the case may be. But to park in front of his home and then to cancel and drive away,
Yeah,
you
without
know,
putting
I
eyes on
know
him. Yeah.
how bad they must feel for doing that. I'm sure
Of
it wasn't
course.
some intentional act. But I think we've all been having those days when anything but one more call. I haven't even had lunch or breakfast yet, and it's been a
Yeah.
long day, and this guy doesn't want to go to the hospital. Fine, well, let's go back. Let's try to get some done or whatever the case may be. But it's those decisions that we make that can be career defining. And,
Mm-hmm.
policies are reactive to these kind of events that happen. So,
So you definitely gave us a lot of examples of, typical situations where we see these most often. But as you kind of mentioned, this really could play out in any kind of scenario, right? I mean, it's not limited to just medical or just police. There's all kinds of different scenarios that I'm sure we could dream up, or even that we've heard recordings of or had real cases on. So, when you're supporting agencies to kind of give them guidance on how to handle this at their agency, what would be one of the recommendations for the best place to start or the best way to identify that this might be something that we're dealing with?
well, I think there's a couple of elements here. Somewhat of it can be managed by state statute, right? It's like in
Mm-hmm.
Utah, there's an EMS statute that if someone calls for medical assistance, someone's going to show up and shake your hand. Not going to
Yeah.
give you a bill, but we're going to show up and shake your hand unless we can validate the person has left the scene. If we know the patient's gone, I talked to his friend and he got in his friend's car and they went out to the clinic, wherever the case may be,
Mm-hmm.
then I can cancel. Other than that, we have to make patient contact, right?
Right.
So there's policy or procedural documents that may be affected by state or local policy or laws, as it were. But I
Mm-hmm.
also think that for for my department back in the day, it started out for us as a patient requesting cancellation of EMS,
Mm-hmm.
or the patient's family in this case had requested cancellation of EMS. And it started out as a seizure. One person called and said his brother's having a seizure, was turning blue, wasn't breathing. And then he dropped the phone to go get him off of the chair onto the floor to do airway control. And another person picked up the phone and was like, hello, who is this? And this is 911. We have
Mm-hmm.
information of a gentleman who's not breathing. We have fire department on the way. And she says, no, 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 no. My brother has cancer. He's dying. My other brother is learning disabled and he doesn't understand what's happening. He just had a simple seizure. I've got him on oxygen. He's breathing now. I don't need you here. I don't want you here. So in that environment, you could hear the dispatcher's voice being very perplexed as to, what to do. And she
I
said,
mean, I
well,
just had the same reaction, like,
I'll tell the fire department what you're saying, but they will probably show up anyway
They'll
just to
come.
talk to
Yeah,
you. She
absolutely.
didn't know about the Utah state statute that mandates that we show up, right?
Shake a hand. Yeah.
So from that incident, we ended up developing, if you're talking to the patient and the patient wants to cancel, if we have multiple apparatus responding, let's say an ALS engine, a BLS engine, and an ambulance, the closest vehicle will respond, no lights, no siren, do an assessment, have you sign an AMA.
Fine. Yeah.
If you're not talking to the patient, nothing changes, here we come.
Mm-hmm.
So you could do that same thing out of that and then when I was speaking with Dr. Clausen and we had those several gone on arrival scenarios, we ended up developing that request for cancellation or gone on arrival policy. So we had kind of both of those things contained where it was reasonable standard is to make entrance into the home. If the officer feels like there's a good possibility the person is inside, then we would make entrance. We will try to get a key or open a window. Worst case scenario, we break the window and buy it for you. And we wouldn't leave
Right.
until we get one of our vendors on site to board up the window for you. But, when in doubt, go in. I mean, I would
Mm-hmm.
never want to leave grandma laying on the floor when I had four firefighters trained outside waiting to help her. We didn't think we could break in or something. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
we have to have police come by and fill out a report that it was us that broke the window and disaster cleanup's on the way to take care of the board up. But that's a cheap price to pay to take care
Right.
of that person. So it's easier to just cancel and know that this person's left. I just can't imagine doing that myself because I've never seen that in my career. If
Right.
they're going to leave, they've always told somebody, oh yeah, she went with her sister, whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not a good decision. And if you don't have a policy to cover it, because then it becomes you and your partner or whoever is with you, you've made a decision that could have impacted someone's life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I certainly never wanted to take on that kind of liability myself sitting in the chair, right? Because you can't see anything, you can't touch anything. All you can go off of is the information that's being provided to you by from the caller, and it's never enough until someone puts eyeballs, somebody physically, shakes the hand of that patient, as you said. So yeah, I would always have a hard time just canceling anything as a dispatcher as well, because that's what we always kind of drill in everybody's head is, err on the side of caution. When in doubt, send them out, right?
Well, but I also think that's why one of the things that we deal with, if you have a patient who's clearly ill, chest pain, difficulty breathing, ultra level of consciousness, and they're by themselves, we encourage the dispatcher to stay on the line if at all possible until EMS or fire or police show up. And sometimes you'll hear the dispatcher stay on the line. We both know this just because the caller is scared, not because the caller
Sure.
is critical, but they're scared. Could be a
Mm-hmm.
child, could be an elderly person, but they don't want to be alone until, someone is there with them, right? And
Right.
so there's one aspect is trying to keep those first party alone callers on the line if there's any sense of urgency to the incident type at all. And then having the dispatch center, if we do that and there's nobody answering the door or whatever the case may be, then to call back and see if that caller will answer the phone. Luckily nowadays most people are calling from mobile phones. So even if they've
Mm-hmm.
gone to the hospital, if they answer, then we can ask them, "Are you at your house?" "Oh no, my sister took me to the hospital down the road."
Right.
But when you're on scene, some of that, I mean, it's sometimes very easy to tell a home that's occupied versus a home that's not occupied. At dusk and there's no lights on, there's no sounds, there's no open doors, no cars in the driveway. You look in the garage and there's nothing in the garage. That's indicative of, potentially someone's not there versus there's a light on, you see a television in the living room, there is a car in the driveway, there is a car in the garage. None of those are guarantees, but the providers on scene need to be a little bit aware of those kind of, scene characteristics that can lead them down the there's nobody here path, or I think there's somebody here that's not answering the door path.
Yeah.
So I think those are all parts. And in that training, having someone, in management authority, the authority having jurisdiction, and also a legal in the room talking about some case law, or talking about what the city or the state or the county deems appropriate for those kind of situations for law enforcement, for fire, and for EMS. If I've got my legal eagle in my back pocket telling me it's okay to do these things, and I know what my path can be, I don't mind breaking the window in the back of the house to have my, what in the fire service you call the hole wrap, the smaller guy in your crew go through the window and check out the house, and
Hmm.
then we'll stay on scene until, somebody gets there to board up the property for us. And then the city would always pay for that damage that we did. That's why we'd have the police come by and do a report as well. So there are simple things that we can do, and everybody has to follow their own company or department policy and procedural documents. But this is one of those things where it takes you 10 minutes or 15 minutes to make sure there's nobody there.
Yeah.
And by doing so, you have, potentially saved a life, and you haven't lost anything other than a window. The worst case scenario, I break the window, or I knock
Right.
something over on my way in as I go through the window. Worst case scenario. The worst case scenario, if I do nothing, is that someone dies and we're put in a very bad light.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things that you talked about that I kind of want to go back to a little bit is, the conversations with the legal eagles, as you said, and kind of establishing what the expectations are. I would imagine that this is a very tall task because there are some tangible things that you can do that you already spoke about, right? Like the things that you're looking for that are true signs of that the, residence is occupied or that the building is occupied versus it's completely unoccupied. But what about those things that are less tangible, right? Those, what if you pull up on scene and there is a TV on, but nobody's coming to the door, right? Like how can those be handled, and do we really just leave those up to judgment in the moment, or how can we kind of set our people up for the best line of success in those situations?
I think the part that's hardest, or was hardest for me, was when we would go to an apartment building, right? It's on the third floor, and I don't
Mm-hmm.
have any windows to the outside. I don't hear any noise on the inside. But
Yeah.
luckily, when you're in most of these apartment, or a good portion of these apartment buildings, you'll have a 007 box somewhere where there's a master key, or you can get a hold of a maintenance person, or there's a sales office person that has a master key that can get us into the apartment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we put ladders up, if it's not too high, we put ground ladders up before as well, jump onto a balcony and, look through the windows and see if we can see someone. And I think that, boy, at the end of the day, I would rather force a door or force a
Yeah.
window. And also, if they told you that it's an 87-year-old person having difficulty breathing, that person did not walk away.
Yeah, right. Or
If it's
drive
a
their car
person,
away even. Yeah.
yeah, if it's a person with elbow pain or something, then it might change the dynamic a little bit. But if it's a person having chest pain, difficulty breathing, had a seizure and woke up and was
Mm-hmm.
calling, from the floor because they couldn't get up, any of those things, I'll try to find the least expensive and least interruptive way I can to get into a property. But at the end of the day, on those kind of things, we're coming in. I would hope
Yeah.
that public safety would just find a way to get it. I mean, we can always get in. I mean, firefighters have never found a locked door. It's just stuck. If you hit it hard enough, it'll always open, right?
Right. I
But
mean,
The
the
police
police
department's
department's
like
like
that.
that too, right?
yeah, sure,
Yeah.
right? But, we can, we used to take the doors, and now we take the window because it's cheaper to replace or force a window, right? So you can get around it so it's not damaged. That really is a cheap price to pay. Realize that if I break your door, the city's buying it, or my company is buying it, whoever that company might be.
Hmm.
But there's value in making sure that person is not in extremis in that house and no one's there with them.
So I think one of the ways from a dispatch and comm center standpoint that we can address this is one of the enhancements that we put in ProQA, at least for medical, on first party callers over the last however many years it's been, that we now have that sort of follow up that if it's a first party caller, the expectation is that the dispatcher will ask, "Are you alone?" Right? And I think that that has a huge impact. Dispatchers may not even realize the impact beyond just understanding, okay, there's someone else there with them or there's not. But also, I think that ties into exactly what we're talking about here, because that's going to help us identify if we are going to be looking for a window to break to get in if the person stops responding or the call gets disconnected for whatever reasons and we get there and nobody's opening the door.
Right. And there's also little things that I think most agencies probably do. Like if we're on scene and we've got a person who is not answering the door, ask dispatch to call them. If I
Yeah.
hear the phone ringing and there's nobody answering the door, the chances the person have left and took their phone or left their phone there, not as high
Very
as they're
small.
still there
Yeah.
with their phone, right? There are
Mm-hmm.
other things, and that could be built into the policy process is try attempt to make contact after the responders are on scene, see if they can hear or see anything indicative of someone being inside the home, or they can hear the telephone or whatever the case may be. And then always, if you feel like you're going to break in, just make sure police is on the way, right?
Mm-hmm.
That way, we're documenting it was this window. If anything else is broken, it wasn't us, but we
Yeah.
broke that window
Right.
right there.
Yeah.
And we made entry through this door. We didn't see there was no one home, and we've already called our board up provider, and they're on the way to take care of that. Now we'll stay here until they get here, and a lot of times the officer will say, "No, you guys can take off. I'll take care of it. I'll wait here for
Yeah.
him."
Exactly.
And that's great, right? Because anybody comes back, there's a cop there, managing or guarding the property. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that these days we know what can happen if we don't do due diligence, right? I think an
Right.
agency has to define due diligence. If you're going to find a man down call in the park or something, how far do you have to look when you don't find him where you thought you had to find him? Is it within 1 block? Is it
Right.
within 2 blocks? How far do you move, right? And that might change from agency to agency because if you're in a compact metropolitan area, the blocks are a little smaller. And if
Mm-hmm.
you're in a suburban area, the blocks are a little bit bigger. So how far do I have to go before I've done my due diligence looking for this patient, right? So
Right.
again, that should be put in writing, or at least within a general context of writing, within 2 blocks or whatever is reasonable based on the circumstances, the age of the patient, the incident they were dealing with, whatever the case may be, right? So those are the
Mm-hmm.
kind of things I think need to be part of their policy as well.
And then, as far as recommendations go, from your experience and everything that you know about this topic, would you recommend agencies, like, let's say we have some listeners out there that are from an agency that maybe don't have a policy in place for this yet? Would you recommend that they start kind of big or small, like to the level of being very general and kind of over umbrella type policies, or would you recommend that they get a little bit more into the weeds and into the details as a best practice?
Well, I think they should do a general policy first, right?
Mm-hmm.
They have an obligation to do due diligence in ensuring that there's no one in the home or the person has moved outside of the general location if they're outside. Something along those lines where I just can't go, well, no one answered the door, sucks to be them. I'm gonna
Yeah.
go home now, right?
Right.
They've got to do something in addition to knocking on the door. They have to do some due diligence. And
Mm-hmm.
then they'll learn from that up to and including police reports, getting a board up vendor, en route to help if they have to break in, whatever the case may be, right? Those are
Right.
some of the things I think like would start with as a baseline report or baseline
Mm-hmm.
policy process. And they should probably, or if they don't already have one, they should also look at a patient refusal process as well. But if they refuse, hey, I'm feeling better now. I don't want your ambulance to come by. We're not on scene yet, They can include those two things together, because I don't think that's a good idea either.
Right. Yeah, we talked about the reasons why that's not a good idea, for sure.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The difference in police is that police typically get called when somebody's mad at somebody else. And so the
Right.
dynamics there are a little bit different as well. They may be getting sent to the subject's address and they're not answering, or so I think if you're doing fire and EMS, I would lean heavier towards gaining entry and finding out what's
Mm-hmm.
going on. If I'm in law enforcement, I think you have to work with the legal team and also with the officers and the police department standard SOPs as far as managing a suspect, as
Mm-hmm.
far as if they don't want to come to the door. And there's probably a level of the law where they would be more required to make entry, in other words, where they could back away and come back another time, right?
Right.
So again, I think
Or
you have
take
to
the report
manage
over
that.
the phone, right?
Right,
For
right.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Discipline specific at certain points within this process, I think is appropriate as well.
Yeah.
Are there any other kind of touch points or bullet points that you can think of for agencies that maybe don't have a policy in place like this yet, that where to start and what major things they need to consider? Because, of course, you and I both know from all of our years of experience combined that you can't possibly create a policy that would encapsulate every single scenario that would play out. So, your best approach is to kind of do like you said, start in a general way, train your people to use due diligence and good judgment, but what does that look like in a policy form?
Well, I think there's the thing that you and I have seen
Mm-hmm.
is that operations is not necessarily involved with the communication center, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think in this one, where it is very specific to both the emergency communication center, responders, and administration, and to some extent the legal, oversight of that public safety arm. I think it's important for all three of those or four of those to be at the table at the same time.
Yeah.
If this happens, inside versus outside, what will the dispatch center do? What will the
Right.
operations people do on scene? What is the legal parameters within our state, within our county, within our city that guides us in doing something or doing little, or maybe maybe sometimes it's doing nothing, like we just talked about for law enforcement. I think there has to be a level of concern or a threshold that's met. And once that threshold is met, I think gaining entry becomes a paramount process. And
Yeah.
that's probably more true in medical than it is, well, I don't know, whatever the threshold is for whatever discipline you're
Right.
working with,
Yeah.
right? And I think once you've met that, then it's simply how can we do this and cause the least amount of damage to the home that we can easily repair or can be repaired easily and does not
Mhm.
cause the owner or the renter, the person that lives there, undue hardship,
Right.
right? If they can't secure their front door, that's a big deal.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So if I can, put a ladder up, heck, I'll call aerial ladder, put them up into the window or onto a
Mm-hmm.
balcony, which is always going to be easier than, taking out the front
The
door.
front door. Yeah.
But I think the conversation can move a little bit organically as long as the administrative people and whatever legal person or legal entity you're dealing with, as long as they're clearing the road. I think some organic conversations between the dispatch and the concerns that we have in dispatch. I can't see, I can't touch, I can only hear. If
Mm-hmm.
they hang up on me, if they say, bag this and they hang up, then does that mean that they're leaving? Does that mean they don't want to talk to you? And
Right.
when they're on scene, what will they do? What is due diligence for them? Working in cohort with the communication center, calling on the phone, doing those kinds of things, trying to call a manager or some type of a building representative or responsible party that may be able to get us into the building or into that room or that apartment or that condo without doing damage. And if we can't and we feel it's appropriate to get in, then it's just trying to do it with the least amount of damage and heartache for the person that lives there.
Yeah, I like it. So, yeah, you've given us and our listeners, of course, a lot to consider. And I love this. I think this is all really critical stuff. I mean, like we said, you can't possibly create a policy that encapsulates every single scenario, but having some really good best practices in place is going to be your best foot forward for sure.
I also think that the agencies could copy or get the history, as it were, from the principal's
Yeah.
book, right? There
Yeah.
are case studies that are there that they can
Mm-hmm.
learn from, and then they can say, oh, okay, so how can we avoid that here? Oh, we can do these things. And they may have not been involved. You may be talking to a city attorney who doesn't understand what we're dealing with here. And so letting that city attorney see some of the history that's there, right? They can
Yeah.
see the history, they can see how many times it's happened and what the instances occurred and what they occurred, and they can go to chapter 2 of the principal's book and look those up and find those, right? So
Yeah.
I would
Excellent.
recommend that, especially if I was a comm center person and I was trying to get others involved, going to a city manager, going to a city attorney, and getting their ear for a little while to have that conversation is a relevant topic as well.
Yeah, because we both know that a lot of times policies can really be born out of really unfortunate situations, kind of the what not to do's and all of the lessons that we learn from those unfortunate case studies that, as you said, as you mentioned, are in chapter 2 of the EMD Principles book. All right. Well, thanks so much, Brian, for joining me today. This is a great topic, and we will definitely include some further recommendations for creating policies for any agencies out there that are looking for some guidance in our show notes. And again, be sure to reference the Principles of EMD textbook for more information on that. And again, thanks for coming and sharing your wealth of knowledge and experience. And I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me on, Meredith. And I think this is one of those things where agencies need to pay attention and don't bury your head in the sand on this one. Other agencies
Yeah.
have paid the price for it. You know, do your due diligence, sit down with your staff, and come up with a plan to manage you successfully. So, all
Yeah.
right, thanks very much.
And
Appreciate it, Meredith.
I like it. Thanks, Brian. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the show, give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to let us know what you liked and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Look for @TellMeExactly to get the latest on all things emergency communications. Tell Me Exactly is a Priority Dispatch Corporation podcast developed by our team of protocol experts and hosted by me, Meredith Jensen, with Cody Ekman as producer, Reading Roberts as sound engineer, Scott Robinson and Jason Barber as executive producers.